Alrighty, testing one, two, three, four. Testing testicles. You have the chocolate Nubian soul brother in the house, dropping the wisdomatic truth bombs. You can rely on me because I'm true blue. Just bear with me one moment here while I get set up. Make sure that you guys can hear me all loud and clear. Make sure I'm not wasting my time dropping all of these wisdomatic truth bombs and doesn't even get across or have audio problems or something. Want to make sure everything is right as rain. Alrighty. Ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, brothers and sisters around the world, it is I, yours truly, Chris Yule, aka the Esoteric Noetic, aka, say with me, the Chocolate Nubian Soul Brother from Ghana, West Africa, dropping the wisdomatic truth bombs here in Melbourne, Australia. Yeah, no, mate, I'm true blue. You can rely on me because I'm on team. Meh. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, click on the bell, tell your friends, tell your Momo, tell your mom, drop us the comments, drop us the cryptocurrencies, let us know what it is, drop us some comments below if you feel so inclined, and let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about aliens, UFOs, UAPs. What's happening? Van Dan Escobar, I like your name. Now, a lot of people might think this topic is somewhat frivolous. It's silly. But ladies and gentlemen, we're in the 21st century. Haven't you realized? I mean, we are at a point now where the New World Order is not some conspiracy theory. It's actually real. It's been real ever since 9/11. I mean, they openly speak about this now. But similarly, UFOs, which are now formally referred to as UAPs, are a real thing. There's been a disclosure project. The mainstream media has been covering this idea, not built of air and imagination, but built off of truth that we are not alone. We have not been alone on this planet, ladies and gentlemen, well, since its inception. Planet Earth is one of many planets, not only within this solar system, which has over 400 billion stars, but within this universe. Think about the infinite amount of planets there are, solar systems there are, dimensions there are. It is nothing other than the most extravagant hubris to think that we are alone in this universe, that there are no extraterrestrials. When you are looking at an extraterrestrial, when you look in the mirror, when you look at me, ladies and gentlemen, we are essentially extraterrestrials, but I'm going to get into that. But before I get into that, let me just start off by saying that there's a lot of tribulations that we're all going through right now, no doubt, right? It has been a crazy 2-3 years. People are starting to realize, the ones that are not asleep, that once many of these topics that were thought of as being nonsense are actually built off of reality, that we are living in very dark times and we are seeing a force that is trying to insert itself and take away our sovereignty and essentially make us slaves to a transhumanist tyrannical system that does not respect the natural law, that does not respect love, freedom, justice, where it expects everyone to bow down to the king, which is basically the state or some dark entity known as the New World Order that has this idea that, well, they're the elite. They get to tell us what to do, right? Now, if you guys are going through strife, if you guys are going through tribulation, perhaps I can offer some words of wisdom, encouragement, that you should take your adversity as an opportunity to show the universe what you're made of. Whatever you're going through, if you're here right now, remember that you are here for a reason, that your story is not over, and it's incumbent upon you to rise and rise until lambs become lions. Plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and say, meh. Actually, don't say that. Say, you will never take away my freedom. You'll never take away my freedom. Like William Wallace would have said. That's right. Evander Escobar. You got to be strong, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that by being strong, you inspire others. You embolden others. Human beings, we're very susceptible to other people. Granted, we're individuals, but we're also a collective. The more strength, the more courage you show, the more it emboldens other people to show courage. I'm going to start off this video by talking about the types of truthers out there, but it's also really reference to the types of aliens out there. Because first of all, human beings, which I'm going to get into in more detail, are essentially aliens, and they're types of human aliens. And in reference to the truth movement, we have the types of human aliens right now, right? We have some truthers, some truth aliens out there that don't want to know what's going on. Yeah, that's right, the Annunaki, but I'll get into that. And I'm sure you guys have come across these people, right? These truthers, they call themselves conscious, but they don't want to hear any negativity. See no evil, hear no evil. I just want to see love. There's too much negativity. Why are you talking about like conspiracies and like all these dangerous things? I don't want to hear about that. Well, these are a type of aliens, ladies and gentlemen. These are the airy-fairy, what I would call right brain and balanced people that only want to focus on positivity. Understandably, because as aliens, as human beings, we are very susceptible to emotion, and it's important to keep ourselves in a positively charged state. But the problem is that if you don't expose yourself to the reality of what's going on, you won't be able to avoid problems down the road. I mean, if you're seeing a car coming, or if there's a car coming down the road and you don't want to see it because, look, you only focus on positive things, right? Well, that car is probably going to hit you. But these are definitely the types of people, at least one type of people I'm seeing in the world right now. And I'm sure you come across them. They're proclaiming to be conscious, but they don't want to open themselves up to conversations that are uncomfortable. And it's understandable, but it's also something to be mindful of. And it can be damaging to not only yourself, if you're one of these people, but to the truth movement by not speaking about the truth. And then, of course, you have the kinds of truthers that are aware of what's going on. They're not ignorant. They fully are aware of it. They'll have these conversations, but they don't want to take steps to avoid this stuff coming into fruition. They realize that we are undergoing this Agenda 2130, that these governments, these businesses are coercing us to give away our rights, our freedoms, our sovereignty. And they're quite willing to just go ahead with it because they're on team. Like myself, right? They're not the black sheep. They just do as they're told. And they think that by just going along with it, it's going to be easier. They want to continue working, and they just want to do what's easier, at least in the short term, right? A lot of people don't realize that by taking the easy path, sometimes it's going to be the hardest path. Sometimes the easiest thing you can do is to take the hardest path. At least initially, it seems like the hardest path, but you're avoiding yourself a lot of problems, right? But there are definitely some people out there. They're a type of alien. I call these the awake, but they don't act as if they're awake people. And then you have the type of people they are called, I'm going to call these guys the warrior kings. Or David Icke likes to call these people the renegade minds. Those that have the renegade mind. The mindset that is awake, is aware of what's going on. They're also willing to talk about what's going on. But more importantly, they act in accordance to their principles, in accordance to virtue. They don't bow down to this tyranny. They bow down before no one but the Almighty, God, Krishna, Buddha, Allah, the unifying field. They do what is right, and they follow their conscience. They are not on team meh. They are on team sovereignty, team freedom. They plant themselves like a tree beside the river of truth, and they say nay to the tyranny. These are the kind of people that will not compromise their principles for anything. When it comes to seeing what is going on, if they deem that to be wrong, they say, look, I'm not going to do it. I don't care what you threaten me with. I don't care if you put a gun in my head. Absolutely, Van Dan Escobar. People like Alex Jones. They have the spirit of God working through them. That gumption, that determination, that vibration of one, force, drive, call it what you will. The Aquarians, the misfits. And people think that these people are a menace to society. Think of any great hero that in their time were looked at as being positive, great figures. No, these figures are only looked at as being great people in hindsight. Figures like Jesus Christ, Gandhi, Joan of Arc, take your pick. These are figures that were not looked up as being beautiful figures by the status quo. They had to fight against the tyranny. They had to speak the truth. They couldn't just play around and say, oh, I love everyone. Oh, all there is love. They had to not only apply themselves with compassion, but also with force, truth, stand for what is right. And it's difficult to do that. It's difficult to see what is going on, acknowledging it to be wrong, and also making the choice not to go along with it. Yeah, the Wu-Tang. Actually, don't know much about the Wu-Tang, but I'm assuming they're badass. I'm sure they wouldn't go along with BS, right? But yes, people that are willing to stand against the tyranny. I call these the warrior kings. I think of this conversation between Krishna and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, this amazing story that speaks about a lot of the things that we're going through now, in a sense. Because, ladies and gentlemen, history repeats. History is prologue. We see elements of the past being played out. History doesn't always repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And there was a great battle that took place many, 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 many years ago. And this same dynamic of what will people say, it's too difficult for me to go ahead and do all of this stuff because so many people are going to suffer. And this conversation that took place between Krishna and Arjuna, where Arjuna was in a position, this is a story dealing with a great battle that took place in India, where essentially forces of good were fighting against the forces of evil. And Arjuna, who is a great warrior, he was one of the Pandavas, brothers, essentially on the side of light. And Arjuna was having a conversation with Krishna because Arjuna was having a moment of doubt, didn't want to go to war and fight against people that he'd been so fond of, and had to develop the renegade mind to do what was right regardless of the consequences. Because people think of what is right in terms of what might happen. Well, the thing is, we can't know that. Doing what is right also takes wisdom. And Krishna instilled this understanding to Arjuna that fundamentally doing the right thing, being a warrior king, being a renegade mind, being the alien, right, the best kind of alien, right, this humanoid alien that is a true conscious person, is required to put aside their attachments to the outcome and live in the moment, do what is right. Krishna said that you are entitled to your labor, not the fruits of your labor. And essentially that meant rather than focusing on what you're going to get from doing what you're doing, you just fall in love with doing what you do because you know it to be right. It's a mindset. And I thought it was very important to perhaps just address the kinds of truths we're seeing in this entire world right now. Because they're important aliens, ladies and gentlemen. We definitely have different types of truthers, different types of humanoid aliens right now with very different mindsets. But all right, I want to get into the crux of this. This is what you guys are tuning in for. I want to talk about the aliens, the Annunaki, the Zeta Reticula, the Pleiadeans, the Nephilim. I mean, this stuff is, it is detailed, ladies and gentlemen. And whereas this might sound like nonsense to a lot of people that are not familiar with this, most things do. Science, technology. If you tried to describe the technology that we have in the 21st century, the vast majority of people a few hundred years ago that were not familiar with it, it would sound like nonsense.
What is this witchcraft that you speak of? Phones that are able to allow you to speak to people across the world? This is nonsense. No, I don't know anything of this. This is foolish.
Well, similarly, when we are speaking about extraterrestrials, I'm basing this off of tremendous resources. There are over 30,000 texts all around the world, ladies and gentlemen, making references to encounters with extraterrestrial life forms. This stuff has been well documented, not just in recent times. This is not just a recent phenomenon, not just spanning the last 100 years or so ago. I mean, there were UFOs being discovered in the 19th century. There were reports of sightings from cowboys, essentially, ladies and gentlemen. And there have been reports of UFOs even in the Bible, and many depictions with artists making references to weird images in the sky. But in more detail, this is spoken about in not only some of our oldest texts within the Western civilization, such as the Enuma Elish, this creation story that makes reference to things that you see within the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Eden, which is basically the birthplace of the human race. But there are civilizations speaking about the different alien races that influence their society. They're often referred to as gods. And there are also many accounts due to the, I wouldn't call it the Freedom of Information Act, but due to just the information from people that have come out, have had the virtue, that have had the warrior king renegade mind mentality to risk their lives and speak about their encounters, we know many of the different aliens that have been reported by people. And many great authors, researchers have spoken about this in depth. To name a few, David Icke, Lloyd Pye, Michael Desarian. Alex Jones touches on this kind of stuff a little, but I think if you guys want to look at a great resource, I would recommend Billy Carson. He is truly a pioneer when it comes to this stuff. This guy has read many of the ancient texts, and this is where I'm basing most of this information from the origins of humanity, from these stories that speak about our origins, whether it is the ancient records found within the Celtic writings, where they speak about the Tuatha De Danann, where they speak about their history, very actual, a fact, but also go into references to things that sound like a fairy tale, because we've been programmed to look at things that we cannot accept as being mythology when they're accounts of history, and then things that the scientific community look at as being plausible as history, when in reality, many of these ancient civilizations make references to races and their history. But anyway, I'm going to start off by speaking about the Greys, right? Anyone that is somewhat familiar with the realm of ufology will be familiar with these mantis-like, insectoid-like creatures that have been reported by many abductees. They have these slant eyes, very black, dark, and many people report these beings as being benevolent and virtuistic and so forth, that there's no way these gray aliens would ever do horrible things, But look, first of all, we got to understand that most of us have very different ideas of what is good and what is bad. A lot of people come from this mindset that they're serving a greater good. So if you look at it from that perspective, you can always say that beings of whatever race are always good. But if you look at this from a classic standpoint of like freedom, rights, that kind of stuff, at least that we do within the human mindset, I would say it's universal. It's not just a human mindset. This should be accepted by all different alien races. Then you'd have to agree that, first of all, kidnapping beings is definitely not a good thing, which is what a lot of these aliens do. And more importantly, that when we are speaking about any groups of people, I want you guys to get a bit more logical with your thinking over here. You need to avoid generalizations. You need to realize that fundamentally we're speaking about groups, and whereas it would be ridiculous for me to say that black people are all good people. We would never do anything, Black people are beautiful people. All we do is bring goodness in the world. We never pop a cap in your ass. Man, no black person's ever killed anyone in their entire life. Black people have never had any slaves. Now, anyone that knows a bit of history realizes that no. Human beings, and that includes black people, yellow people, people of all races, granted, we have groups. We're made up of individuals, and we're not all the same. And the same applies with extraterrestrials. So when we're making reference to the Greys, granted, I'm going to be generalizing here, but I want you to realize that, yes, even generally, from a very general mindset, the Grey aliens have been complicit in doing some dastardly things. They essentially have kidnapped people. They have been in league with the U.S. government. There were treaties that were made. I think it was, I want to say Roosevelt is known to have made a classic treaty during the 40s with these Ray aliens known as the Greys. Essentially, these aliens are from the Zeta Reticuli star system. And I'm basing this not from air and imagination. There are tremendous resources speaking about this. Figures like Bob Lazar have made reference to obtaining information that gave him an indication in regards to the origins of the crop that he was working on. But you see, when you start coming across this information time and time again, you're able to cross-reference the information that you see. When you hear something enough times, when you've read the cornucopia amount of data that I have on this topic, ladies and gentlemen, you start seeing things over and over again. You're like, yeah, that seems plausible because I've heard it enough times from different accounts. That's how you piece together the truth, ladies and gentlemen. And when I'm making reference to the Greys, these are beings that have been responsible for kidnapping many of the humans here. And essentially they come from the Zeta Reticuli star system. They are very advanced. But yeah, here's a truth bomb that I'm sure many of you would not be aware of. They are essentially workers for another race of aliens known as the Reptilians. Now this sounds very fanciful, right? Like you often see in these science fiction movies, these weird creatures that have reptoid-like features are very aggressive, right? I think a lot of these creators are actually basing this stuff on the lore of the reptilians. Now, the reptilian races are actually supposed to be the masters of the Greys. Essentially, they get the Greys to do their dirty work. And once again, this is based off of a lot of references. Another thing to bear in mind is that many different civilizations speak about the reptilians, the Greys. They have different names for them. In regards to the reptilians, they are known as the Draco. They are essentially that thing you hear about in fiction movies of weird dragon-like entities. Mostly, at least they have dragon-like features. Their scales. Now they have a humanoid form, and there have been many not many, but at least some documented encounters. There's a researcher known as, I wouldn't call him a researcher, but a geologist that was essentially working on S4. This is an underground base that is a few miles away from Area 51. This is the classic site everyone makes reference to. However, the real site is S4. That, to not digress too much, was doing some underground digging in S4 and actually came in contact with a whole subterranean network and encountered one of these Dracos, the Reptilians, and had a firefight with this being, and it left a horrible injury with him that was cancerous, was killing him, and this injury had not been created by any normal weapon. But this guy had a deep account of not only his interaction with this thing, because bearing in mind, this isn't a guy that was some kind of weird, crazy conspiracy theorist like yours truly, right? This is a normal guy that was a geologist of some sort, was digging using very advanced technology in a base, and was not told by the. I want to say government, but fundamentally, you guys need to realize that the government, exoterically, the government that most of you people make reference to is not the government that is really in charge of what's going on in terms of the research into dealing with aliens and so forth, building these underground bases for other, what we call black op projects. There are factions within the government. This is what we refer to as the black ops. There's a tremendous amount of tax dollars that go into this black op fund and is used to do hidden research, esoteric research, ladies and gentlemen. The Department of Navy is probably the most well-known establishment that has been tied to a lot of this secretive behavior. Bob Lazar has made reference to this, but fundamentally, without pointing fingers, there is definitely a black ops project, and they're the ones that are responsible for delving into this area. This is not just in the United States, but this happens in many countries. But just speaking specifically about let's say the Black Ops in the United States, this figure, his name is Phil Snyder, was a geologist that essentially was digging underground in S4 and came across these Draco, the Reptilians, and they are described in lore as being all of the classic qualities that we would associate with evil. I mean, just from a very visceral level, and bearing in mind, these are based on many, many, many different reports. They stink. The kind of stench is unfathomable. They're referred to as being very telepathic in their ability to manipulate people without using words. They are extremely tall, and there is lore in the ancient texts. So not just based off of like eyewitness reports. There's lore all about these figures, not only in Africa, they're referred to as the Chitahuri. In Africa, there's a great researcher known as Credo Matwa. Has been interviewed many times by David Icke that would speak about in detail his personal experiences with these creatures. And it's uncanny how the resemblance is always to that of these reptoid-like beings that are very menacing. People that want to say, oh, look, there are no evil aliens. I blow all of that stuff out of the water. You only need to look at the people that say that have not researched this in terms of the ancient accounts in history. Because if you were looking at these ancient texts and reading this with, for instance, many of the biblical texts that make reference to demons and so forth, you realize that we're dealing with entities here that are essentially extraterrestrials. Because most people look at good and evil in terms of demons and angels, when they're actually in reference to, I mean, from a science fiction perspective, but actually just from a clear perspective, you're dealing with beings that are essentially extraterrestrials. Many of the demons that they're making reference to in these biblical writings are actually these beings that live in deep subterranean networks in the earth, the Draco, that have actually been on this planet for a long time. I'll need to get into that another time, but I know I'm going off in tangents over here. There's so much information I'm trying to condense, but essentially the reptilians are supposed to be the nastiest. They are essentially the controllers of the gray. They come from the system known as Orion, and there is a fascinating account dealing with how these beings, we're talking many years ago, were essentially fleeing their planet by what we'd call another extraterrestrial race known as the Elohim. But let's talk about these as being the good guys that were essentially trying to clear out this plague on the solar system, or essentially this universe per se, right? And this plague was known as the Reptilians. And this sounds very fanciful, but this is also, you can see a lot of ties here to a lot of the Gnostic texts. Essentially, they make reference to a being that was responsible for a lot of destructive negativity and so forth. And I have looked at these beings as being the Reptilians in the way that they've been depicted. But anyway, that's another alien race you should probably be familiar with. They are called the Reptilians, and these are the nastiest of the nasties. Now, another race that is not so well spoken of, but are definitely looked at in a positive light, these are the Pleiadians. Now, you probably heard of a movie called Avatar that was featured, I think, a little over a decade ago, ladies and gentlemen, and I think the second one is coming out. Now, when I think of the Pleiadians, I think of the Avatar people, because they're described very much like these beings. They're very tall. They have Nordic-like features, depicted as being blue or very light in complexion, some of them, and they're generally the ones that are associated with beneficence. I want you guys to understand that in the same way that there are many different countries, many different nations around the world with many different cultures, when we're looking at extraterrestrials, when we're making reference to the ufology scene, we're not just dealing with one race here. In the same way, we're not just dealing with one craft. It's not like, oh, they're aliens, they're good, they're bad. There are many different races that have been interacting with this planet for a long period of time. And one of the most fascinating people actually makes reference to these people is a guy by the name of Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols was someone that was involved in something known as the Philadelphia experiment, from what I remember. And this is really the genesis of a lot of this, what I call paranormal activity that really paved the way to a lot of conspiratorial ideas. Now, Preston Nichols wrote a book dealing with his experiences in something known as the Montauk Project, which is an umbrella term for a lot of the experimentations that were done in this secret base, dealing with a whole bunch of stuff from time travel to extraterrestrials and so forth. And this guy, I want you to understand, like, whereas you can dispel a lot of the information that this guy came up with, I don't, you could, but make no mistake about it, Preston Nichols was actually one of the pioneers of the technological age. We're not dealing with momos here. We're dealing with, like, along with Preston Nichols, Tesla, Einstein, maybe a couple of other names, these guys were at the heart, the genesis of what we call the technological age. And many of them had affiliations, not just with the government, secret governments and so forth, but with the whole extraterrestrial agenda. Preston Nichols speaks about about attaining so much of this knowledge in regards to the understanding of technology and whatnot. And this probably sounds a little fringe, but through his interactions with the Pleiadians, and this gets a little metaphysical, but this was done fundamentally on a more metaphysical level. Like he had some kind of a experience where he would, not through his physical form per se, but essentially through some kind of a dream state, was able to download a lot of information through interactions with these people known as the Pleiadians. But I think he may have had some actual interactions with them on the physical. But this gets they're very speculative, but there are many references to these beings known as the Pleiadians, and they actually make up much of the lore in the lore of the Norse mythology. and much of that which has transpired around Earth's history. Another race. Now, this is the race that everyone is somewhat familiar with because of people like Zecharia Sitchin. This is the race of the Anunnaki. But the thing is, this is just an umbrella term. When we're making reference to the Anunnaki, typically most people are making reference to the aliens that came from the modern day Iraq, Samaria, this area, because typically this is where we see the story about these beings coming from planet X, Nibiru, and essentially influencing the hominoid life. I'm not going to get into that story. I think I've done that on several occasions, but it's not just in reference to the Anunnaki, are not just in reference to, let's say, one specific group of aliens that come from one region known as planet X. It's basically a term that means those that from heaven came down. And it's interesting because within a biblical sense, when you hear about that, you think, oh, we're speaking about angels, right? Much of the stuff that you hear in the Bible where they're making reference to these angelic beings. I mean, you guys got to check out the book eludes my mind right now, but there is a biblical book that did not make it into the Bible where I think it'll come to me later on, but the book of where basically one of these figures is speaking about his interactions with these angelic beings that have the characteristics of extraterrestrials. And much of the stories you hear from the Bible making reference to Eden, the Adam and Eve, the Adamah. I mean, this stuff is plagiarized. This is all coming out of the Enuma Elish, which is a creation story where we get the same concept of the Anunnaki from, where they're speaking about these aliens that essentially came down, manipulated the human race at the time. Bearing in mind, that's not to mean that human beings are extraterrestrials. I mean, we've gone through manipulation many, many times. I mean, human beings are not just made up of not just naturally evolved on this planet, but they, in the same way that we genetically manipulate, I'm pretty sure we're at a point now, at least on the exoteric, where we're able to genetically manipulate beings. This stuff has been done many times through the time of Lemuria, Atlantis, and we have cultivated beings on this planet that are not purebloods per se, not purebloods in the sense that they haven't taken experimental mRNA technology, but purebloods in the sense that their origins are more tied to planet Earth. But no, the human race is actually manipulated many, many times, and there are many researchers like Lloyd Pye that will show incontrovertible evidence within the genetic structure, from the manipulation of the telomeres to the fusing of chromosomes, to show there is clear evidence to anyone that actually understands this area, which I don't, by the way, when it comes to genetic manipulation, but I understand enough to know, because I've seen this time and time again, that there is evidence to show that the genetic code within human beings has been manipulated. There is no way this stuff has come about in what we call a natural way, in terms of this evolving over the last few thousand years or so. This stuff has been, and the thing is, it's not a theory per se, it's basically what we are seeing written in these texts, right? Anecdotal information, which consists of things that have been written down, right? And then we see evidence, corroborating evidence. That to me is a very strong circumstantial case. That I take that very seriously. When not only do I see civilizations speaking about their history, things that are verifiable, but they speak about how these people got here. And then I can see all this corroborating evidence to support this stuff within our genome, within the artifacts and so forth, areas that have been decimated with weapons, for instance, that are reminiscent of the weapons that are used and or made reference to in these texts. But these are some of the logical thought patterns I use in determining the validity of this kind of information. Anyway, I digress. The Anunnaki, just want to make that clear, is making reference to many different types of aliens, but specifically when we're looking at modern-day Iraq, which is supposed to be the genesis of, well, at least for the last few thousand years, the human race. So we're looking at Babylon, ancient Egypt. They all tell the story of these people that essentially came down from the stars, making reference specifically to planet X, Nibiru, but it's also encapsulating, I use the term Anunnaki to make reference to essentially non-terrestrial beings, so beings that are not of this Earth, of this planet Earth. Because in the same way that we are actually, and I know a lot of people think that we haven't been out of this planet yet. A lot of people that have a very low TQ, don't believe in technology, think that all of these efforts to get off the planet is just fake. Oh, there are no satellites, the Earth is flat. Oh, no, mate, we're not at the stage where we can technologically leave this planet. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been leaving this planet for a long time, well before the technological age of the last 100 years. But human beings have been, not only can we look at the ancient accounts to have a look at space travel, but in recent, all you got to do is just watch TV, which you probably shouldn't be watching because most of it's full of shit. But it's very easy to see live streams of the kind of technologies that we're using, having a look at SpaceX, and realize that we're at a point now where we're actually going to be a multi-planetary race. We're going to be moving into different planets, and this is on the exoteric. It's not to say that this stuff is new, that we haven't been doing this for a long period of time. So another topic that's related to the Anunnaki is the Nephilim. This is something that you hear. That's right. The book that I was talking about, I think it's called the Book of Enoch. This is the book that I wanted to mention that makes references to these beings in a biblical sense, bearing in mind that the Bible that most people are familiar with, is an assortment of many, many different ancient texts. It's the plagiarized texts of many different writings. A lot of this stuff is coming from ancient Sumeria, right? That's why it has elements of believability, because it's like taking real shit, but then it's embellished this shit and added all this other stuff, made these extraterrestrials as angels or demons, right? When they're actually in reference to like beings of this physical Euclidean meat space. It's not to say that there aren't angels, there aren't real beings of high power that align with the ultimate force of creation, God, call it what you will, but it's that human beings have a tendency of obfuscating information. We do this. I do this. I embellish shit. I say shit to make things more interesting, you know? That's why you guys got to check all this information right now to make sure what I'm saying is true. And the more you do this, you start seeing a picture like it. But you know what? I think it was like this. I think you come up with your own ideas about what happens, but you can base this off of, once you have enough information, you can start forming your own ideas. Rather than these people that have no knowledge about these topics, and they just, ugh! I think aliens come from, like, our poo. Seriously, some of the theories I've heard from some people are along those lines. It's like, no, man, I feel like aliens are, like, from the future, and, like, we're aliens in the future. Yeah, man. And granted, look, that may be plausible, but there is, I mean, if you were basing this off of actual information, it would be more credible. But anyway, I digress once again. So in regards to the Nephilim are essentially, they're like demigods. And I say gods not in the big G sense, but when I say gods, I'm making reference to extraterrestrial, the beings, the Anunnaki. Now, the Anunnaki essentially came, without wanting to make this a long 1-hour rant, the story within many of the different texts around the world is they actually mated with human beings. We were similar enough genetically, after some time, bearing in mind, not in the onset, but once these beings actually started manipulating the beings of the planet, they got to a point where they're actually able to breed with us, and many of their offspring were what we call the Nephilim. These were beings that had not only had the animating force of God working through them, because all creation, all life has this force, this animating principle, you know, regardless of whether or not it's been genetically manipulated, created in a lab, or whether it happens naturally through the centropic force of the universe, or through the natural process of life. But there's always this animating force working through us within creation that is within everything from on the macrocosmic level to the macrocosmic level. The planet is alive. Your cells are alive. You are obviously alive. You're conscious regardless of what people tell you. But the point I'm trying to make is that they also had the DNA of these extraterrestrials, which was such that they had programmed, well, they had the DNA such that they had certain latent abilities, more so than the beings of this planet. Bearing in mind that human beings, whereas there are many iterations, there's human being 1.0, 2.0, and this is kind of going into the creation story, because essentially the Anunnaki manipulated human beings once. They had problems. They were too rebellious because they had too much of their higher thinking. Essentially, they had the alien DNA, a lot of latent abilities, awareness, understanding, and so forth. So essentially, they manipulated these beings. Eventually, in the 2.0 version, after they started rebelling, they manipulated the human beings again to be like them, but not so much like them that they were too intelligent and would start rebelling. So essentially, you have, without making this too convoluted, you had beings that were very conscious, having the very similar DNA to these extraterrestrials, right? I suppose you'd say they're the Nephilim, but then you had beings that were not as tied to the alien DNA. They were not as what we call godlike, as connected to these aliens. But without making this thing too convoluted, essentially the Nephilim is in reference to demigods, gods with a lowercase g, so the offspring of the Annunaki. And the story, at least within the ancient Sumerian writings, shows that many of these Nephilim essentially were put in positions of power around the world by these aliens in order to essentially have kingship, rulership over certain areas. And if you follow the line, I mean, the whole concept of the right of kings, the right of the blue bloods, comes from this concept. People speak about the divine right of kings, and they wonder where that came from. Oh, that came from the Bible. Yeah, because God had bestowed power for these rulers to rule over the planet. No, Momo. That actually comes from this concept dealing with how, I mean, granted, we can trace, I mean, this is well known that you can trace many of the presidents, many of the rulers of the Western world, and many of these different civilizations to, at least within the Western world, to Charlemagne, to, I forget this guy's name, but this is well established. One of the kings of England. And this is many of the vast majority of presidents that have been established within the United States, and this applies with European countries as well, to these elite, these kings, to these rulers and so forth. What's interesting is you can also trace back these kings and rulers and so forth to the ancient Sumerian kings. And we're talking about the Sumerian kings, these same kings that the ancient Sumerian writings speak of as being the Nephilim, as essentially being the offspring of the gods. Sounds fanciful, right? But yeah, that's the esoteric knowledge that you probably don't hear so much about in the mainstream. So essentially, this establishment of rulers has been established through the Anunnaki, and this is a thing you find not just within the Western world, but it's a thing you find within many different civilizations all around the world, from Asia to South Africa, or to Africa rather, to basically the gods. These beings would pass on their offspring to different factions, and they would essentially have rulership. So anyway, speaking about the Nephilim there, I think we've covered quite a lot of different alien races, but I want to speak most about my favorite alien race, and that is the chocolate Nubians. No, these are just human beings, essentially. And I kind of made reference to this. The humans, most human beings. Now, granted, we have ties to this planet, this terrestrial planet, but we're a merger of this. Our DNA is not something of this Earth, but it also has ties. If you follow many of these stories to these extraterrestrials that essentially manipulated the human genome. But it's not to say that you are them per se. A lot of people look at this in a very materialistic mindset, that their body, this vehicle that you're using to express yourself, is you, and therefore you are your ancestors. Well, you are not your ancestors. Your ancestors are many people, many different races, and this is basic common sense, but also many different alien races. But more importantly, they don't make up who you are. Granted, there are certain inclinations that we have because we have taken on the DNA from our ancestors and many of these extraterrestrials, and many researchers have hypothesized that many of the tendencies that we find that we associate with being destructive and evil and so forth, these are foreign to what we call humanity in the purest form, but are actually something of a malignant entity from an extraterrestrial race, right? Like this greed, this need to conquer and so forth. These are things that you found within many of these extraterrestrial beings and so forth. And there are many references to these figures talking about their greed and xenophobia in the Bible. If you read this with learned eyes and so forth. But in any event, the point I'm trying to make is that we are not just a sum of our DNA. We are multidimensional beings. We are a spark of God manifesting itself in this Euclidean meat space reality. And it's important to take notice of that. Now, on a more kind of tangential note, when I was making reference to the chocolate Nubians, it is interesting to note that the Nubian kings, I always make reference to this, these are people that came from Kemet, the land of the black, ancient Egypt. but it consisted of many different areas within this area we refer to as Africa. And a lot of the knowledge we found within the West is from this ancient knowledge, because many of these, well, at least some of these Annunaki essentially set up base and promoted much of the information, this knowledge within this part of the world. After the massive cataclysms took place, Egypt, this period known as Kemet, was one of the areas that was chosen as to reinvigorate society with this knowledge. Bearing in mind that, I mean, this is just one era of aliens. There have been pre-Diluvian civilizations making reference to Atlantis and Lemuria, where there are many extraterrestrials that were also influencing humanity and so forth. So this is a very long epic. The planet we're talking about billions of years old, right? It's also interesting to note that many different civilizations make reference to these extraterrestrials under different names. I find it very interesting that, granted, we speak about Kemet, most of these chocolate Nubian soul brothers will speak about how a lot of this information came from Kemet. I know Infinite Warder speaks about this a lot of times. Billy Carson speaks about this a lot of the times, but it's interesting to note that Ireland, the oldest civilization in Europe, was also the birthplace for much of this knowledge that came from, this is within their text, their folklore, came from the Tuatha De Danann. Their first king, King Nuarda, was the king of the Tuatha De Danann. And these are a group of people that came from essentially Atlantis. And it's spoken about in their mythology about how these people came from a place from the north, the extreme north, known as the Hyperborea. And after these massive cataclysms, Ireland was one of the few places that was established. But it's interesting that regardless of what account you make reference to, whether it's the Kemetic knowledge, whether it's the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, or the mythology within the Tuatha De Danann, they all speak about the Great Flood. And this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I mean, you can throw away a lot of this information, but you've heard me speak about many times this flood. And I've seen this so many times throughout many of these references that I think, oh, this obviously happened. This flood took place. Many of these civilizations obviously came about from this is after this flood. I mean, so we have Ireland, then we have Kemet, and you see the theme. You cross-reference this information, you can see that, okay, there's definitely something to the fact that there are many civilizations that have knowledge about the planet before this great flood. Many of their texts have been preserved, and granted, they use different phrases like they call let's say the Reptilians the Draco, or the Chitahuri, or the Kachinas. This is what the American Indians would call them. But they all make reference to so many strong themes that I've seen time and time again, that there must be a shred of truth to this story. And this is how I arrive at my understanding of this. I don't just look at some book called the Bible and say, this must be true because it's written by God, when it was written by people. I read some of the Bible, throw away the stuff that doesn't make sense. I read the ancient Sumerian texts, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Celtic mythologies, the many, many different texts, the Dogon tribe in West Africa that make reference to how they got their knowledge. Same story as what you find within ancient Egypt from a race of people. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Sumerians, they all make reference to how this knowledge was obtained by the guardians of the sky, or those that from heaven came down. And granted, you can say that this is just hoo-ha, this is just religious nonsense, but if you are going to believe that all the technologies that they've created are real, and they explain how they create this, why wouldn't you believe how they got their technologies if they're telling you that they got this stuff from the gods with lowercase g? In any event, that covers a lot of the alien races. I hope you found that informative. My brother from another mother wanted me to speak a bit more in depth about the extraterrestrial races, as I've alluded to this in various other videos and so forth. But ladies and gentlemen, be sure to like this video, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your mom, share this to someone that you think might find this information fascinating, and let me know what you think. Let me know if you want to hear more about this stuff, if you want me to stop talking about all this weird paranormal stuff and stick to like real science, when the truth is much of the science that we're calling science right now is not actual science. It's just the obfuscation of science, and it's basically big pharmaceutical interests paying out companies to come out with the science that they want. And this also goes with history. Much of history is written by the people in power or the victors. That's why it's incumbent upon us to do our research and to cross-reference many different sources and realize that the truth is not going to be found within one ideology, one system. Many aspects of the truth are found within different religions and different extraterrestrial races. Ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks, until next time, remember there are three things that cannot remain hidden for long: the sun, the moon, and the wisdomatic truth bombs of the chocolate Nubian. So brother. Surya Namaskar. Namaste. Peace be upon your butt cheeks. Peace in the Middle East. Be sure to check us out on all my platforms. You can find us on chrisshul.com. And, yeah, you can find me everywhere, really. Until next time. Peace, Jordan and Benell.
Peace.